There is a specific smell that permeates a precinct after 25 years. It is a cocktail of stale coffee, floor wax, gun oil, and the lingering, metallic scent of adrenaline that sticks to people when they get hauled in through the booking cage. To most people, it smells like misery. To me, Detective Sergeant Marcus Holloway, it smelled like home. I ran the Major Crimes Task Force for the 12th District, a unit I built from the ground up to tackle organized crime and high-level narcotics trafficking in a city that was slowly trying to claw its way out of the Rust Belt. I wasn't just a cop, I was an institution. I had a clearance rate that made the mayor smile during press conferences, and a network of confidential informants that ran so deep I could find out what color underwear a cartel boss was wearing before he even put them on. I survived 3 mayors, 4 police chiefs, and 2 gunshot wounds. I thought I had seen it all. I thought I was untouchable, not because of arrogance, but because of necessity. Then came Julian Thorne. Thorne wasn't a cop. He was a civilian administrator, appointed by a city council desperate to trim the budget fat. His official title was Director of Strategic Resource Allocation, a title that sounded important, but really meant he was a professional hatchet man with an MBA and 0 hours on the street. He didn't know the difference between a Terry stop and a traffic stop, but he knew how to make a spreadsheet look bleeding red. Walked into the station on his first day, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, carrying a tablet instead of a notepad, and looking at us like we were artifacts in a museum that was about to be closed for renovations. I remember the first briefing. The squad room was packed, the air thick with the tension that always comes when the brass changes hands. Thorne stood at the podium, not behind it, trying to project a casual authority that he hadn't earned. He started talking about synergy, lean operating procedures, and legacy costs. I looked around at my guys. Detectives who had spent weeks in surveillance vans peeing into bottles. Guys who had missed their kids' birthdays to take heroin off the street. They looked tired. Thorne looked energized. He started by cutting the overtime budget. That was the first warning shot. In major crimes, overtime isn't a luxury, it is the lifeblood of an investigation. Criminals don't punch out at 5 o'clock. If you are sitting on a wiretap and the target starts talking about a shipment coming in at 3 in the morning, you don't go home because you hit your 40 hours. You stay, you listen, and you act. When I tried to explain this to Thorne during our first one-on-one meeting in his pristine, glass-walled office, he just tapped his stylus against his teeth. He told me that if my detectives couldn't wrap up their cases within a standard work week, it was a failure of time management, not a lack of resources. I tried to explain that we were tracking the Vipers, a biker gang that had recently moved into the fentanyl trade. We were weeks away from a Riccio indictment that would decapitate their leadership. Thorne looked at me with dead shark-like eyes and told me that long-term surveillance was an inefficient use of manpower. He wanted stats. He wanted arrests. He wanted numbers he could show the city council next month, not a big bust 6 months down the line. The conflict escalated when he went after the fleet. My unit relied on unmarked vehicles, seized sedans, beat-up trucks, cars that blended into the background of the worst neighborhoods in the city. Thorne decided that maintaining a fleet of non-standard vehicles was a logistical nightmare for the motor pool. He ordered us to transition to a standardized fleet of marked cruisers and a few generic, identical, gray sedans that screamed police presence from 3 blocks away. I stormed into his office that day, slamming a stack of surveillance photos on his desk. I told him that if my guys rolled up to a buy-bust operation in a brand new Ford with government plates, they would get made instantly. I told him he was putting officer safety at risk. Thorne didn't even look at the photos. He was looking at his monitor, adjusting a pie chart. He told me that the visual deterrent of marked units was statistically more effective at preventing crime than covert operations. He cited a study from a university in a town that had 3 cows and 1 stoplight. I told him we weren't trying to prevent jaywalking. We were trying to stop a gang war. He told me to lower my voice or he would write me up for insubordination. That was the moment I knew we were on a collision course. It wasn't just about budget cuts anymore. It was ideological warfare. Thorne believed that policing could be done by algorithm. He installed software that predicted hot spots for crime and demanded we deploy resources based on the computer's suggestions. The problem was, the computer only knew reported crimes. It didn't know that the reason no 911 calls came from the chaotic housing projects on 4th Street wasn't because it was safe, but because the residents were too terrified of the Vipers to call the cops. So, the algorithm sent patrols to the wealthy suburbs, where Karens called in suspicious dog walkers, leaving the actual war zones wide open. My detectives were furious. We were being pulled off active investigations to patrol quiet neighborhoods, just to satisfy a heat map on Thorne's iPad. The Vipers started getting bold. We heard chatter from our remaining Cs that the gang knew the heat was off. They were moving larger shipments, recruiting younger kids, expanding their territory. I documented everything. Every denied overtime request, every pulled surveillance team, every ignored intelligence report. I built a paper trail because I knew, eventually, something was going to break. The breaking point for the unit came 2 months into Thorne's reign of terror. We had a confidential informant, a kid named Leo, who was embedded deep with the Vipers. Leo was giving us gold. He told us about a massive shipment of fentanyl coming in from across the border, enough to kill half the city. This was the big one. This was the bust that would justify the entire year's budget. I went to Thorne to authorize the buy money and the tactical team for the takedown. It was a standard request for a high-risk warrant service. We needed the SWAT team on standby, air support, and about 50 grand in flash money to show the sellers we were serious before we took them down. Thorne looked at the request form like I had handed him a dead rat. He asked me what the ROI was. I stared at him, confused. He asked me what the return on investment was for the $50,000. He wanted to know if we were guaranteed to seize enough cash and assets to cover the expenditure and the overtime for the SWAT team. I felt a vein in my forehead start to throb. I explained as calmly as I could that the return on investment was keeping 10 kilos of lethal poison off the streets. I told him that you can't put a price tag on public safety. Thorne sighed, the kind of condescending sigh you give a child who doesn't understand math. He told me that the department was pivoting away from high-risk, high-cost interdiction. He said the optics of a militarized raid were bad for community relations. He denied the funds. He denied the SWAT team. He told me to pass the tip to the feds and let them handle it, knowing full well that by the time the FBI bureaucracy processed the intel, the shipment would be broken down and sold on the corners. I slammed my hand on his desk, cracking the glass top. I told him he was letting a major cartel set up shop in our backyard because he was worried about a spreadsheet. He stood up, smoothing his tie, and told me that my antiquated cowboy mentality was exactly why he was brought in. He told me I was relieved of command of the task force effective, immediately pending a disciplinary review for my aggressive behavior. I walked out of that office with my badge heavy in my pocket, feeling a mixture of rage and terrified clarity. I went straight to the squad room. My second-in-command detective Sarah Jenkins saw my face and knew. She asked me what happened. I told her Thorne pulled the plug. I told her the Viper operation was dead. The room went silent. These detectives had lived this case for 8 months. They knew Leo, the informant, was out on a limb. If we didn't make the bust, if we didn't pull Leo out with the witness protection protocol that came with the arrest, he was a dead man. I started packing my personal effects into a cardboard box. The photos of my kids, the old coffee mug, the framed commendation from the governor. Thorne had already sent the email. I could hear the phones pinging in the pockets of my detectives as the notification went out. Restructuring of Major Crimes Unit Command Staff. It was fast. It was brutal. But Thorne wasn't done. He didn't just fire me, he dismantled the unit. He reassigned Jenkins to the property clerk's office. He sent my best surveillance guy to patrol the airport. He replaced them with rookies fresh out of the academy, kids who looked good in uniforms and knew how to use the new tablets but wouldn't know a gang sign if it was spray painted on their windshield. He appointed a new head of the unit, a guy named L.T. Sterling, who was a notorious yes man, a climber who would polish Thorne's shoes with his tongue, if it meant a promotion. Sterling's first order was to purge the confidential informant files, claimed it was a liability issue, that keeping off-book assets was a lawsuit waiting to happen. I tried to warn them. On my way out, passing the security desk where I had swiped my badge for 2 decades, I saw Sterling and Thorne laughing near the elevators. I stopped. I shouldn't have, but I did. I walked up to them, box in hand. I looked Thorne dead in the eye, and told him that the Vipers weren't a line item. I told him that by neutralizing our network, he had just created a power vacuum that was going to suck the whole city into a bloodbath. I told him specifically about Leo. I said, that kid is out there because we promised him protection. If you cut him loose, his blood is on your hands. Thorne just smirked. He actually checked his watch. He told me to enjoy my retirement and then the department would forward my pension paperwork. He said, we're modernizing, Sergeant. You're just angry that the future doesn't need you. I walked out into the cold night air, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind me. It felt final, felt like the end of an era. For 3 days, I sat at home. I drank too much scotch. I yelled at the TV. I ignored calls from my union rep, who wanted to fight the suspension. I felt helpless. I knew the rhythms of the street, and I could feel the tremor coming. You can't disrupt the ecosystem of the underworld without consequences. The Vipers were expecting a transaction. When the police didn't show up to bust it, when the pressure suddenly vanished, they wouldn't think it was luck. They would get suspicious. They would start cleaning house, and they would start looking for the rat. On the 4th day, the news broke. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the classifieds, wondering if I should take a job as a mall cop, when my phone blew up. It was Jenkins. She was crying. She told me to turn on the news. I flipped on the local channel. The banner at the bottom of the screen was red. Mass casualty. Event in downtown district. The reporter was standing outside a warehouse, the same warehouse we had been surveilling for months. There was smoke pouring out of the windows. Ambulances were lined up 3 deep. But it wasn't a fire. It was a war zone. The reporter was breathless, talking about a shootout that had spilled out onto the streets, about automatic weapon fire, about civilians caught in the crossfire. I grabbed my keys. I didn't have a badge anymore. I didn't have a gun. But I drove toward the smoke. As I got closer, I could hear the sirens. Not 1 or 2, but every siren in the city. I pulled up to the perimeter tape, flashing my retired ID to a rookie, who looked like he was about to vomit. Ducked under the tape and found Jenkins near the command post. She was shaking. She told me that Sterling, the new yes-man lieutenant, had tried to execute a soft approach warrant based on the algorithm's risk assessment. He had sent 2 patrol cars to knock on the door of a fortified warehouse containing 10 kilos of fentanyl and 20 heavily armed bikers. Thorne had insisted on a low-profile inquiry to avoid overtime costs for the SWAT team. The Vipers had opened fire with AK-47s before the officers even got out of their cars. 2 rookies were pinned down, bleeding. But that wasn't the disaster Jenkins was crying about. She pointed toward the ambulance bay. They were wheeling out a body bag, but it was small, too small to be a biker. Then another one. Civilians. The warehouse was next to a community center. When the shooting started, bullets went through the walls. But the kicker, the thing that made my blood turn to ice, was when Jenkins handed me a tablet, showing the live feed from the police helicopter. The Vipers weren't just shooting, they were burning the evidence. The smoke was toxic. Fentanyl smoke. It was drifting over the neighborhood, And in the middle of the chaos, the camera zoomed in on a figure slumped against the back alley wall of the warehouse. It was Leo. They had executed him and left him on display. I saw Thorn then. He was standing by the mobile command center. For the first time, he didn't look like a polished executive. He looked pale. He was shouting into a radio that nobody was answering. He was holding his head in his hands. The optics. He was so worried about were now a national news helicopter circling overhead, broadcasting his failure to the world. He had wanted to save $50,000 on a SWAT team. I looked at the chaos, at the paramedics working frantically on a pinned down officer, and I knew the bill for his savings was just coming due, and it was going to be paid in blood. I walked over to him. He saw me coming. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading recognition, like a man drowning who sees a lifeline. I stopped 3 feet from him. The noise of the scene was deafening, but I spoke softly. You wanted to modernize, I said. You wanted to run this by the numbers. Well, look at the numbers, Julian. Count the bodies. That's your ROI. He tried to stammer something, tried to blame the intel, but I cut him off. I told you. I warned you. Now, get out of my way. I wasn't in command anymore, but the uniform officers around us, the guys who knew me, the guys who were currently bleeding because of him. They parted like the Red Sea. I walked past the bureaucrat and toward the tactical commander, a guy I'd known for 15 years. He handed me a spare vest without saying a word. I wasn't on the payroll, but there were men down, and the Vipers were still shooting. The aftermath was worse than anyone could have predicted. The shootout lasted 4 hours. The toxic smoke sent 40 civilians to the hospital with respiratory failure. 3 officers were in critical condition. Leo was dead. The Vipers escaped through a tunnel system we knew about, but that Sterling hadn't bothered to read the file on. They disappeared into the wind with half the drugs and all the money. The city was in a panic. The mayor was holding a press conference within the hour, demanding answers, and all eyes turned to the Department of Public Safety Operations. The investigation into the disaster started the next morning. Usually, these things take months. Internal affairs, independent review boards, the slow grind of bureaucracy. But this was too big to bury. The National Guard had been called in to assist with the hazardous material cleanup. The police union was calling for heads to roll. And Thorn, in his infinite arrogance, tried to pin it on me. He tried to claim that I had withheld critical intelligence upon my departure, that I had sabotaged the transition to the new leadership. He went on TV, looking solemn, and told the cameras that disgruntled former employees had compromised the operation. He thought because he had the suit and the title, he could control the narrative. He thought he could write a report and make the reality go away. He forgot one thing. He forgot that I was a detective, and detectives document everything. I was sitting in my living room when the summons came for the emergency city council hearing. Thorn was there, flanked by lawyers. He looked confident again, having spun his story. He had his charts, his graphs, his projections showing how his new system would work if given time. I walked in alone. I carried a single flash drive. On it were the emails he ignored, the risk assessments he denied, the audio recording of him calling the SWAT team a waste of capital, and, most damning of all, the time-stamped log of me warning him specifically about the Viper's firepower and Leo's vulnerability. I sat down at the witness table. The council chairwoman, a stern woman who had lost a nephew to fentanyl the year before, looked at me. "Sergeant Holloway," she said, "we have heard Director Thorn's testimony. He claims this tragedy was the result of an intelligence failure on your part. What do you have to say?" I plugged the drive into the presentation laptop. "I don't have anything to say, Mom," I said, leaning into the microphone. "But I have something I'd like you to hear." I played the recording. The room went silent as Thorn's voice filled the chamber, dismissive and arrogant, laughing off the threat of the Vipers. "I don't care about your gut feelings, Sergeant. I care about the budget. If you want to play soldier, go join the army. We are not authorizing a raid based on the word of a junkie informant. Thorne's face went the color of curdled milk. The lawyers shifted in their seats. The chairwoman looked from the screen to Thorne, her eyes narrowing into slits. I wasn't done. I pulled up the R.I. email where he explicitly denied the safety equipment for the officers who were currently in the ICU. I projected it onto the 20-foot screen behind him. It was undeniable. It was cold, hard proof of gross negligence. Director Thorne, I said, turning to face him. You treated this department like a business. You cut costs. You streamlined. You optimized. And because of that, a 19-year-old kid is dead in a morgue, and this city is terrified. You saved $50,000 on that raid. I hope it was worth it. The fallout was swift, but it wasn't just him getting fired. That would have been too easy. The union sued him personally for endangerment. The city stripped his immunity. The press tore him apart like a pack of wolves. He didn't just lose his job, he lost his reputation, his career, and eventually, his freedom. He was indicted for criminal negligence. As for me, the mayor asked me to come back. He offered me the chief's desk. He offered me a raise. He offered me whatever I wanted to clean up the mess. I looked at the badge sitting on the table. I looked at the scars on my hands. I thought about the smell of the precinct, the coffee, the gun oil, the misery. I'll come back, I said. But not as chief. I'm a detective. Put me back in major crimes. And get that computer out of my office. Thorne went to prison for 3 years. I visited him once. He was working in the prison library, stacking books. He looked at me, gray and defeated. He didn't say anything. He just went back to his stack. I walked out to my car, an unmarked, beep sedan that smelled like stale coffee. I keyed the radio. Major crimes, 10-8, I said. Welcome back, Sergeant. The dispatcher replied. And for the first time in months, the city smelled a little less like a spreadsheet. And a little more like justice. But before I could even sit down in that reclaimed chair, I had to deal with the second head of the Hydra. The administrative apocalypse that had been silently ticking away while we were busy counting shell casings. You see, the shootout was the loud disaster, the one that made the 6 o'clock news, but the real catastrophe, the one that threatened to release 1,000 inmates back onto the streets, was happening in the server room, and it was a direct result of my final act of malicious compliance before I walked out those doors. To understand why the entire judicial system of the 12th District ground to a halt 3 days after my reinstatement, you have to go back to that final meeting with Thorne, 10 minutes before he took my badge. He had been obsessed with digital transformation. That was his buzzword. He wanted to eliminate the legacy physical media, which was his fancy way of saying he wanted to throw away 50 years of case files, handwritten detective notes, and physical surveillance tapes to save money on storage rental fees. He had contracted a company called CloudSafe Solutions, a lowest bidder vendor based out of a strip mall in a different time zone, to host our entire criminal database. During my termination meeting, while I was still seething about the Vipers, Thorne had handed me a memo. It was a direct order to immediately migrate all active major crimes case data to the CloudSafe portal and liquidate physical backups to ensure compliance with the new lean office policy. I looked at the order. I looked at Thorne. I knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who has worked with government technology since the days of fax machines, that the CloudSafe portal was a glorified Dropbox account with a bandwidth limit lower than a teenager's cell phone plan. I knew that our surveillance files, terabytes of 4K video, wiretap audio, and high-resolution crime scene photography, would choke their servers like a grape in a garden hose. I also knew that liquidating physical backups was a violation of state evidence retention laws, but Thorne had signed a waiver claiming that the digital copies were the master, authoritative records. You want me to upload everything? I asked him, my voice dangerously calm. The REAK predicates, the cold case DNA profiles, the active wiretaps, all of it? Right now. Immediately. Thorne had said, checking his cuticle. And do not leave the building until the progress bar hits 100%. I want a clean slate for the new team. No paper. No clutter. Just data. And the physical files, I asked. Shred them, he said. Or ship them to the municipal incinerator. I don't care. Just get them out of this office, so we can install the new ergonomic standing desks. That was the moment the switch flipped. If he wanted data, I would give him data. I went back to my desk, not to pack, but to initiate the transfer. But I didn't just drag and drop the files, I followed his instructions to the letter. He wanted Vive all, active data. So, I went into the archives, I pulled the raw, uncompressed footage from every body camera, in the last 5 years. I pulled the full, spectrum audio logs from the dispatch servers. I pulled the digital dumps from seized hard drives that we hadn't even cracked yet. I queued up nearly 4 petabytes of data. Then, I looked at the bandwidth settings. The department had a throttle in place to prevent one user from crashing the network. I disabled it using the override code that only the unit commander possessed. A code Thorne had forgotten to revoke. I set the upload priority to critical immediate. I opened the command line and stripped away the error, checking protocols that slow down transfers to ensure data integrity. Thorne wanted speed. I would give him speed. I hit execute. The progress bar appeared, estimating completion in 4 hours. I then walked over to the physical file cabinets, the clutter, and called the municipal records team. I had them load 300 boxes of critical evidence onto a truck bound for the deep storage salt mines 3 counties over, technically complying with his order to remove them from the office, but ensuring they would be irretrievable without a court order and a mining crew. I walked out. The system hummed. The little green lights on the server rack in the basement began to blink. Then they began to flash. Then they went solid. Fast forward to the week of my return. Thorne was gone, but the ghost of his stupidity was haunting the machine. The first sign of the meltdown came on Tuesday morning at 0900 hours. We were prepping for the arraignment of the surviving Vipers. I sat down at my terminal to pull up the chain of custody logs for the seized fentanyl. I clicked the icon for the case management system. The hourglass spun. It kept spinning. Then the screen flashed a color I had never seen before, a sort of violent, sickly magenta, and displayed the message EROR 590. BNDIDH Lumandi XCED DAKO RPIO DAKIDE INCC to R7. I picked up the phone to call IT. The line was dead. In fact, the entire phone bank in the squad room was dead. I walked out into the hallway and saw the lights flickering. The building's HVAC system was groaning, making a sound like a dying whale. The air was getting hot, stagnant, and smelling faintly of ozone. I ran down the stairs to the basement server room, the nerve center of the precinct. The door to the server room was hot to the touch. I swiped my badge. Nothing happened. The electronic lock was fried. I kicked the door near the latch, popping it open. A wave of heat hit me that felt like opening an oven to check a turkey. Inside, it was pandemonium. The cooling fans on the server racks were screaming, spinning so fast they were vibrating the floor. Cheaper option. Racks that Thor had installed, refurbished units he bought from a defunct crypto mining farm, were glowing. Literally glowing. The plastic casing on the Ethernet cables was starting to melt, dripping distinct black globs of insulation onto the linoleum. Standing in the middle of this inferno was the new IT director, a 20-something kid named Kevin who Thorne had hired because he was the nephew of a city councilman and knew about computers. Kevin was wearing a polo shirt that was soaked through with sweat. He was holding a fire extinguisher in one hand and a manual for a completely different server system in the other. He looked at me with eyes the size of dinner plates. "It won't stop," Kevin screamed over the roar of the fans. "It's trying to upload everything at once. It's pulling power from the building grid to compensate for the thermal load. I can't shut it down?" "Why can't you shut it down?" I yelled, shielding my face from the heat. because Director Thorne removed the manual kill switches to save on installation costs. Kevin shrieked. He said hardware resets were inefficient, and that we should manage power cycles via the cloud. But I can't reach the cloud because the network card just melted. The malicious compliance had worked too well. By forcing the system to upload the uncompressed, massive files continuously, I had created a digital bottleneck that locked the hardware in a loop of maximum exertion. The cheap hardware couldn't handle the thermal output. The AC units, which Thorne had also dialed back to eco mode to save 12 cents an hour, had given up and died hours ago. We were minutes away from a catastrophic hardware failure that wouldn't just wipe the Viper data. It would wipe everything. Every warrant, every mugshot, every piece of digital evidence for active murder trials. Pull the main breaker, I ordered. I can't, Kevin yelled. The breaker panel is behind the racks. If I go back there, I'll get cooked. I looked at the racks. Sparks were starting to shower down from the ceiling, where the power conduits connected. This wasn't just an IT problem anymore, it was a structure fire waiting to happen. Get out of here, I told the kid. He didn't argue. He dropped the extinguisher and bolted. I grabbed a heavy rubber floor mat, threw it over my head like a shawl, and dove behind the server racks. The heat was intense, singing the hair on my arms. I could hear the capacitors popping like gunfire. I found the main power coupling, a thick black cable feeding the entire bank. There was no switch. Thorne had hardwired it to bypass the surge protectors because the surge protectors kept tripping during his efficiency tests. I had to sever the connection physically. I pulled my service baton, extended it, and wedged it behind the cable housing. I braced my boot against the scorching metal frame and heaved. With a sound like a cracking whip, the cable tore loose. A massive arc of blue electricity snapped through the air, scorching the wall where my head had been a second before. The room plunged into darkness. The screaming fans spun down into a death rattle silence. The only sound was my own heavy breathing and the yes drip, drip, drip of melted plastic. I had killed the servers. But the disaster was just beginning. When the power went out, the magnetic locks on the holding cells upstairs disengaged. Thorne, in his infinite wisdom, had connected the physical security sys to the same, centralized, power grid as the servers to streamline energy consumption. When the server load spiked and I cut the power, the fail-safes didn't kick in, because the software controlling the fail-safes was currently stuck in a reboot loop on a melted hard drive. I scrambled up the stairs in the dark, my flashlight beam cutting through the smoke. I could hear shouting from the booking floor. "Doors open!" The doors open. I burst through the stairwell door into the booking area. It was chaos. The electronic heavy steel doors that separated the holding cells from the processing area were sliding open. Inside those cells were the 20 Vipers we had arrested after the shootout, plus a dozen other assorted felons from the weekend sweep. They were spilling out into the hallway, realizing that their cages were open and the guards were outnumbered. "Secure the exit!" I bellowed. My voice, practiced in decades of shouting over sirens, cut through the noise. The desk sergeant, an old-timer named Miller, was wrestling with a biker who had grabbed a stapler and was trying to use it as a weapon. I tackled the biker, driving my shoulder into his gut and sending us both crashing into the fingerprint scanner, which shattered. I cuffed him with a zip tie I pulled from my vest. "Miller, the Sallyport doors!" I yelled. "They're offline!" Miller shouted back, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "They're stuck halfway open." The Sallyport, the garage where the paddy wagons unload, was the weak point. If the prisoners got to the garage, they could slip under the half-open bay doors and disappear into the city. And we had no radios to call for backup because the repeater on the roof was dead. "Block it," I ordered. "Use the vehicles." I ran toward the garage. 3 Vipers were already sprinting for the daylight visible beneath the stuck bay door. I didn't have a gun. I had left it in my desk when I went to fix the computer. But I had the keys to the cheaper option. fleet, the generic gray sedans Thorne had forced on us. I jumped into the lead car, a budget model with cloth seats and a 4-cylinder engine. I keyed the ignition, sputtered. Of course, Thorne had delayed fleet maintenance to balance the quarterly budget. The battery was dying. The Vipers were 20 feet away. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. The engine wheezed, then caught. I peeled out, not toward the street, but sideways, drifting the car directly in front of the bay door. I slammed the brakes and the car skidded broadside, blocking the gap with metal and glass. The Vipers slammed into the side of the car, pounding on the windows, screaming threats. I locked the doors and sat there, the flimsy sedan rocking as 3 massive bikers tried to flip it over. I watched the door handle flex as they yanked on it. Thorne had bought the base models. They didn't have reinforced glass. The window cracked. A fist came through, grabbing my collar. Just then, the cavalry arrived. Not the SWAT team, but the fire department. They had responded to the automatic alarm, triggered by the server room smoke. 6 firefighters in full turnout gear stormed into the garage with axes and halogen bars. You don't mess with firefighters. Even the Vipers knew that. They backed off as the fire captain laid into them with a stream of water from the truck outside, blasting them back into the holding area. Like ragdolls. We spent the next 12 hours manually securing the precinct. We had to use physical keys, which nobody had used in years and half of which were missing, to lock the cells. We had to process prisoners using pen and paper, which confused the rookies so much I had to give an impromptu seminar on how to write a booking sheet without a drop-down menu. But the real fallout came the next morning. The courts opened, and the district attorney called me. He was hysterical. "Where are the files, Holloway?" he screamed. "I have a murder trial starting in an hour." I went to download the ballistics report from CloudSafe, and the website says account suspended for non-payment. I started laughing. It was a dark, tired laugh. "Thorne," I said. "He set up the account with a corporate credit card. The city froze his assets when he was indicted. The auto-pay bounced." "You're telling me," the DA stammered, "that the evidence for the state Ves. Rodriguez is being held hostage by a budget web host because of a declined credit card?" "No," I said, leaning back in my chair and putting my feet up on the desk, creating a scuff mark on the cheap veneer. "I'm telling you that the digital evidence is gone. The servers downstairs are slag. The cloud account is locked. The backups were destroyed per Thorne's order." There was a silence on the line so profound I thought he had stroked out. "However," I continued, "if you send a truck to the Iron Mountain salt mine facility in Sector 4, you'll find 300 boxes of physical files that were mistakenly shipped to long-term storage instead of the incinerator. I believe I personally packed the Rodriguez file in box 422. I could hear the DA weeping with relief. "And sir," I added, "when you send the budget request for the retrieval fees, make sure you put Julian Thorne's name on the invoice. I want him to see how much it costs to move paper when he gets out." The cleanup took 6 months. We had to rebuild the server room from scratch. We had to manually re-enter data from dusty paper files, a task that I assigned to the rookies as a rite of passage. But we never went back to the efficient way. We kept the paper. We kept the old cars. And every time a bureaucrat from City Hall walked in with a tablet and a bright idea about cost cutting, I would just point to the scorched outline of a human silhouette on the server room wall. A little artistic embellishment. I asked the painters to leave and say, "The last guy who tried to save money almost burned down the building. Do you want to try, or should I show you the door?" They usually chose the door.